Hi, this is a screencast for ACCI Belfast. We're going to be looking at the examiner's report that was written for the P2 corporate reporting exam that was sat in June 2013. Now this examiner's report basically goes through the structure of the exam and also picks out any points that the examiner felt students struggled with within the exam. So he basically starts off his report by just making a notice to the structure of the exam, noting that there was a compulsory question for 50 marks, and then also that the students had a choice of questions. So I think whenever you haven't sat this exam before, it's good to try and get an understanding of the structure of the exam. By reading the examiner's report, they sometimes would put in areas that maybe students had struggled with. For instance, whenever they're choosing which questions to do in the exam. We're seeing here that most candidates attempted 3 questions and there is little evidence of time pressure. Now this is something that should give you comfort going into this exam. So what you need to be focusing on here is not solely on time pressure, but on the content of the exam, because sometimes you'll find that you're going into an exam and you might know everything about it, but the time pressure is very tight. But in this exam, the examiner's noting that people weren't really having this problem. He's saying that where people fell down was with poor exam technique or also from a lack of knowledge. So this is something that definitely we can work on. Time pressure is something that you can't necessarily change because an exam is going to be in a lot of time, but lack of knowledge and poor exam technique can definitely be addressed before you're going into the exam. And it's something that you should be constantly trying to improve during your studies, especially for this exam. So just the exam technique, he's really trying to focus in on here and basically the lack of it. He's saying that a few simple procedures can help the candidate. So he's saying again that people are not necessarily being instructed in these exam techniques. So maybe the traditional method of teaching is coming more into play when people are focusing just solely on getting through the content, whereas they perhaps should be focusing, putting more focus on the exam technique. Because at this stage in the game, everybody knows how to get the content and to learn the information, but it's how we're actually going to put these answers down in the exam that people are struggling with. So something that he was saying was quite evident in this exam is that there was no good structure, or there was a lack of structure in some of the answers, and also that maybe some of the answers were not actually written down in an organised way. So if you've ever heard of word vomit, this is something that seems to crop up an awful lot when people are doing exams, especially whenever they know an awful lot about the topic. They feel that they need to write absolutely every single thing down that they know about it in order to gain the marks. But that's really not what the examiner is looking at for in this particular paper. And whenever you're getting to the professional level, what they're really wanting you to do is to apply your knowledge to specific facts within the question. So it's not just about what you know, but how you're able to apply it to specific scenarios. So one way to try and overcome this problem is basically try and pick out even just simple quotes that you relate your answer to. So by inserting even 1 or 2 words from the actual scenario, you're showing the examiner that you're trying to pinpoint your answer to the facts in the scenario. And if you're perhaps maybe missing a mark or missing the point here and there, by quoting from the question, you actually will probably try and focus you'll focus your mind more in to what you're trying to do, and you'll help yourself along with the examiner in trying to see where the points are actually being made. Something else that he was saying, surprisingly I think at this level, is that people weren't using proper sentences, and also that there was evidence of text language. Now, if you're sitting a professional qualification exam, you really should never be trying to abbreviate unless this is an actual abbreviation that, maybe is accepted, such as the abbreviation of ACCA for, itself, for example. but you should never be using text language, and you should never be giving anything else but like, improper, or if you should always be using proper sentences. So this is something, very simple things that you can do in order to score more points. Another point which I think is something that could probably boost your confidence with this syllabus a bit more is that the subject lends itself to spaced learning and not mass learnings. So basically you do not need to inundate yourself with learning the same thing over and over and over again, but you really should be trying to apply the technique and to apply everything. So if you get a good understanding of the actual concept, you'll be able to score well in these different questions. So then goes on to focus on question 1, where you were required to prepare a group consolidated statement of financial position. So another thing he's saying is that you should never try and question spot. He says this a wee bit further on down, and I think it's something that you need to really take on board, because there's never going to be a specific pattern. And for instance, if you solely learn just group consolidated statements of financial position and you don't learn the consolidated income statement, then you're really going to fall at the very first hurdle, and you're not going to pass this exam. So definitely do not try and question spot, as if it comes up in question 1, then there's half of the exam that you're really not comfortable with and you're not going to be able to answer well. So there was a number of different elements to this. He's saying here to us that the partial goodwill was used, but there was also an impairment calculation. Now this seems to have been fairly dealt with in the exam, so it sort of shows that people are actually starting to understand what crops up in the exam much more. So goodwill and impairment of goodwill is definitely something that you should be knowing inside out before you go into this exam. The next is a loan to a charitable organisation where there was a subsidised rate of interest. Now this required a reduction in the fair value of the asset whenever it was first meted. So the key thing here is that you were trying to reflect the economic substance of the transaction rather than just taking it at face value. And this is something that people who hadn't covered the full syllabus would have missed. Again, there was acquisition of accommodation where the fair value fell, but this was reflected in the financial statements. But then there was a quick and unexpected recovery in the market, which then should have led you to revalue these offices upwards. There was restructuring plans that had been announced, and again we need to have a clear understanding as to when we should be making provisions within the accounts and when these restructuring expenses should be actually recorded in the accounts, and actually what expenses should be recorded. Then there was also the group pension plan, which needed to be accounted for. So we've said that in question 1, candidates generally scored well. So that's something that's showing that question 1 is a main focus of students whenever they're actually studying for this exam, but also that a lot of people start the exam and actually just go for question 1 first of all, which means you're going to have a lot of nervous energy that you're going to be pouring into this question, and you're going to really be focusing on the question. And if a 3-hour exam is a long time, you are definitely probably going to score most of your points within the first 2 hours rather than in the last hour. These restructuring costs, now I was saying that you need to understand when you should be recognising these in the statements, and also what costs. So only the costs that result directly from and are necessarily entailed by the restructuring may be included. So they give an example such as the employee redundancy costs or the lease termination costs. Now, picking out these costs to include for the restructuring costs would come with practice and also with a good understanding as to the concept behind it. Another point he was making is just one that I had mentioned earlier, was this idea of question spotting. Again, definitely not a good idea to do in this exam. and it's something that you should bear in mind. So try and cover all of the syllabus before sitting this exam. Question 1B then wanted you to explain to the directors what impact on the financial statements goodwill would have had if it was calculated using the fair value of the NCI as opposed to the method that you had been asked to use in part 1A. So this question was worth 9 marks, and I think whenever you're looking at a question, whenever you're seeing the marks that are allocated to it, it should have indicated to you that it wasn't necessarily just the calculations, but then the explanation that went along with this was really going to score you the bulk of the marks. The last part, which is a part sometimes people would skip over because they maybe think it's not worth very many marks, but it's something that it should be easy marks. So you're asked to discuss whether the views of the director regarding the point, there's no point in an accountant studying ethics. Now this should just ring alarm bells, and it's something that is just so straightforward, and basically anybody, even if they didn't study accountancy, could have a good stab at this. So just in summary, question 1 seems to have been quite well answered. Just one or two things maybe just showing that students aren't necessarily covering all of the syllabus. And also just in regards to part 1C, always try and attempt the questions. If you don't necessarily know them, don't get too bogged down in them, but common sense questions such as this part 1C should definitely be attempted, and will gain you maybe a mark that's going to help you score just over that 50% and help you pass.